So thank you so much for making time to come here. Yesterday I was in this talk and people were just reflecting on Bell Hooks' work. And there's this one quote that really caught my attention, where she was saying that hurt brought her to theory. So such spaces can also be spaces of healing. As we theorize, we find healing and also connect with the self and others. So thank you so much for making time. And Sfundo, it's a pleasure having you and having to explore this subject with you. So this is not going to be an interview per se, it's going to be a conversation basically. But of course, to start from who you are, I know you've introduced yourself, but let's get back to the personal. Who are you in the world, and your work, how is it informed by who you are, and what are you really fighting for, or what is your work about? I think that would be a good starting point.
All right. Thank you, Princess. So who am I? It's a very loaded question. Let me contextualize it for a moment or two. Sfundo Sosibo is the name. Once more, I am a writer, a poet, a playwright, and a scholar, and a teacher as well. Started teaching from the age of 19, so it's been a good 10 years now. Taught in various platforms, in schools, lectured at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. And basically my work, however, as a creative and as a scholar is to look at queerness as a queer body myself, as a queer African body, as a queer male African body. We tend to move differently within the world, within our society, within our communities, in relation to everybody else, our counterparts. And my interest has been to look at how queerness has been viewed,
What's happened, by the way? Okay. Is everybody still here? Is it my network or Sfundo's?
I think it's Sfundo's.
Sfundo.
Okay.
He froze. Yeah, he's back again. Let me just let him in.
He's just rejoining.
Okay.
Hello, colleagues.
Hello, Sfundo. Welcome back.
Sorry about that. Technology happened. Where was I? Yes, looking at queerness from an African perspective, particularly because there seems to be a pervading rumor within even Black scholarship that queerness is somehow a Western import, that it hasn't existed in Africa. And I think when one looks at the picture in its full scope, we find that indeed queer bodies, queer human beings have existed since the beginning of time. So that's where I come in as a playwright and also as a scholar. It is to look at these different epistemologies and these different understandings within the continent regarding queerness. And so as to, you asked me, what am I fighting for? Well, the idea here is to educate myself with my own history as a queer body, but also to educate others who would be interested in my art and in my research regarding how it is that queer humans have existed in the continent, in the Black community, and furthermore.
Thank you so much. I mean, you spoke about the African subject, African queer subject and its exclusion. I wanted to ask you that, could that be the point then of resistance? What are we resisting for?
I think we're resisting. Resistance occurs in different avenues and at different platforms. it's not just one holistic experiences, because as we know, human beings experience the world differently from one another, even though we can collectively identify as the queer community, we can collectively identify as the Black queer community, our experiences rather are different. And so for me, it's resisting and rebelling in all spheres of life, because homophobia exists in the household, it exists at home with our parents, it exists at school, in our classroom. Some of us have testimonies of when we were young and we were being, victimized as individuals, but also resisting in a larger part of society, because one of the things that I shy away, even though homophobia is so pervasive, is so ubiquitous, particularly in the Black community, one of the things that I shy away is not to identify myself as a victim, even though I have been through homophobia and it sometimes have been traumatic. What I want to do is through my work, through my writing, through my research, through even my teaching, is to instill a sense of agency for us as queer human beings, because the dangers of perpetually perceiving ourselves as victims is that we then strip ourselves of our agency, right? And we walk, we navigate society and the world in general, understanding ourselves as perhaps less than, or perhaps as, subject to the woes of existence. And I say, no, let's perhaps flip the script for a moment or two. Perhaps it's an hour-long play, perhaps it's a minute-long poem, and let's give the Black queer body his or her agency, and let's allow them to move as an individual within their sovereign rights with their society.
Interesting, but then again, I think to myself, who's giving the queer body the agency? Is there somebody who has to give it agency? Is the agency not found within? Because as the queer body moves in space, right? I think that is a form of resistance, because to be queer in itself, especially within an African setting, certainly where I come from in Zimbabwe, it's an act of courage to just walk in the street, right? It's an act of courage to just be. So I'm just asking about the role of the body there in the resistance. Who's supposed to give this agency?
I think the queer human, the queer body is supposed to instill themselves that sense of agency. And hopefully whatever work I can do can perhaps inspire that at some level. But I agree with you in the sense that if we say that there's an external body, there's an external institution, individual that is supposed to enshrine the queer body with some form of agency, then again, we are allowing or relying on the external, on the powers that be, on either governments or institutions to say, you have a right to be human, you have a right to exist. But I agree with you when you say, indeed, the very instance of being, right, of navigating these different spaces that can be completely hostile at some point, all the way to what is lethal. I mean, we've seen in the past 2 years in South Africa a rising of reported crimes against queer bodies, right? So I think the mere instance of being in a space, in an institution, in an office, in a classroom, in home, in church, and claiming one's queerness, whatever that may be, I think for me is a form of resistance, because it says, well, indeed, queer people are here and they are queer and they are proud of it. And that perhaps can inspire what I'm hoping is the coming generation to also assume their sense of queerness in whatever form that may be.
I kind of like as well how you alluded to the idea that there's a rise in crimes against the queer community, especially in South Africa, which ironically has progressive legislation around that. This is to say, again, I think within the African context, it's much more than having this beautiful prescripts, legal scripts, right? It's also about, yes, it's also about societal perceptions, which means there's a lot of work, there's a lot of educational work that has to be done in our communities, in the society, because it doesn't make sense how with such progressive legislation in South Africa, we still have maybe the highest number of violence against queer community members, be it corrective rape, death, etc.
Absolutely.
So yeah, it's quite interesting. So there's a lot of education work that has to be done. So again, I come back to, there are a lot of people here, or some people here, who may want to know why resist? Why? What is the point of resistance?
Very interesting question. Going back to South Africa's constitution regarding queer bodies, I also think it's indeed interesting that although homosexuality was decriminalized back in the Mandela regime and same-sex marriage was legalized in 2006 under the Mbeki regime, we still have such a high number of violent cases of homophobic crimes against queer bodies, right? As you cited, corrective rape, murder, etc. And I think for me, that is precisely what we are resisting. Because again, homophobia for me does not exist in a vacuum. It's not just that one preacher who is citing the Bible and saying it's an abomination. It's not just the parent who kicks out the child at home. It's not just the teacher in the classroom who, you know, discriminates against the queer student. I think for me, homophobia exists as a web, right? It is all these particular instances and more that allow for finally the extreme version of homophobia, which is seen through the reported crimes and violence. So I think for me, the resistance is precisely that. It is to say that although all of this is happening and continuing to happen to queer bodies, we shall not be silenced. We shall not self-center ourselves. We shall not edit ourselves. We will continue to exist, right? And even as you said, the mere factor of existence and claiming one's queerness is a form of resistance, right? Because for me, the feeling is if we just simply say we're giving up or we're allowing for the status quo to perpetuate itself in regards to queer bodies, I can specifically speak about the South African context, then we run the risk of not having the generation that's coming after us, not only from a personal level, but even from an intellectual, philosophical, and artistic level, not to be able to claim their right or sense of existence. And that for me is how and why we resist.
That's quite interesting, but I also want to redirect you to, so we are speaking about resisting against, like, let's say global homophobia, right? We've spoken about that. We've heard a lot about that, how people are being killed, queer people are being raped, etc., queer people are being excluded. But I want us to localize it a bit, contextualize it a bit, because I think that's where your work really comes in, to say, within the African context, what are we resisting for? Or what is it that we hope for, especially for the queer African subject? For example, this idea of wanting to reclaim an identity that queer people have been stripped of, right? Can we perhaps unpack that? As a queer African subject yourself, what is it that you are resisting or fighting for in terms of your identity as an African person?
Oh, that's a very loaded and interesting question. I think for me, it's multi-layered. However, as I continue to conduct my research, what has been interesting to discover, because I'm currently conducting research based on ritual theater, and I'm looking at queerness from an African epistemology, and I'm using ritual theater, or scripting of ritual theater as a form in which to engage and explore that. So for me, in terms of queer identity, particularly in the African paradigm, what I found as I continue to research as a scholar and as an artist, in that indeed we have done ourselves a misinformation in assuming or in perpetuating, as I said before, that the rumor that queerness is an African, that it is a Western import, and that all queer bodies that have existed have some sort of immoral Western influence, and that people can simply do away with that. That's not what I've found. What I've found instead is that in countries like Burkina Faso and in Mali, for example, according to Dr. Malidoma Some and his wife and his late wife, Msobo Some, for example, is that within these countries, within the Dagara and the Dojon, the Dagara of Burkina Faso and the Dojon of Mali, queer bodies have been understood to have a spiritual gift, meaning that they are identified and elevated within their societies as priests and shamans, right? Also interesting, another note is that there's a sand cave painting in Zimbabwe. I think it's Guruvu, is that correct? Is that correct? Yeah. There's a sand painting, there's a sand cave painting that can be dated from 1 to 11,000 years ago, that shows a queer ritual from what the scholars are understanding is between a priest and their subject. But also, more so to localize it in South Africa, there seems to be a rising scholarship that is suggesting that within the Nguni cluster, queerness has been associated to be a form of ancestral possession, and that queer bodies within the past, in pre-colonial times, when they were identified, they were initiated into what we call ubungo, that is becoming a sangoma, a shaman, a diviner, a healer, artist of the people and of the general village. And that's quite interesting to me to note as a queer being myself, who happens to be with ancestry, who happens, to exist in this realm as one who ought to be initiated to heal people I haven't initiated yet, because obviously you're appalled. But it's interesting for me to note that in different societies within the African continent, there have been a recognition of queer bodies as those with some form of clairvoyance or spiritual gift. And I enjoy alluding to that in terms of my research and my work, because then it sparks conversation around what is traditional Africa. But obviously, if our spirituality is as sacred as it seems to be, to me at least, within the African context, then the queer body becomes a key player within that paradigm and within that form of epistemology.
Interesting. I see the Catherine citing that is almost time. But I just also wanted to say that in my own work as a scholar of the taboo, I've kind of said that I don't think it's useful for us to even tap into history to justify the existence of the queer body. Does that make sense? Because almost like you have to substantiate existence. You go and fetch cave paintings to suggest that there were queer people in Africa at some point. The very existence of a queer person in this dispensation in the now is enough evidence to suggest that there are queer people in Africa, but also to kind of focus or to be limited to that kind of discussion, keeping on substantiating existence, is also taking a lot of time away from the queer bodies, from the work that they should be doing. You don't need to justify existence. For me, it's about access access to the African identity, and African identity is made up of many things. So access to spirituality, access to many things that make us African, community, belonging, you know what I mean, support. So I think maybe we have to move towards redirecting our efforts to not substantiating the existence of the queer because they are here, but to moving towards fighting for access.
Sure.
I can tell you, for example, today, if your partner passed on Sfundo, there are rituals that go with that, right? Sure. And I think as a queer person, what you would want is for community to be there to help you grieve and access these rituals that facilitate for healing. But you're not going to get that because you're queer, considered a European agent, right? So I think for me, we would want to move towards that. But maybe your last words, and of course, if you have one poem to share with us before you leave, I know your poetry is also a way in which you've been kind of resisting and fighting. And also just to say, with the queer subject, the forefront is not necessarily the forefront. Sometimes this forefront is subtle.
That is true. That is true. But I also think it's not in a sense to justify queerness, right? Someone just cited Toni Morrison, my favorite author, who speaks about racism in the sense that bigotry always asks you to substantiate, to justify, to. I think for me, it's more from a writing perspective to note this form of existence in terms of queerness in the African context or African paradigm, because I wish not to have things unsaid that I have come across, because a lot of times when I'm in conversation with individuals about something like this, they go, oh, I didn't know this was a phenomenon that exists. But so for me, particularly as a theater practitioner in terms of ritual theater, it's to look at how queerness can exist within that paradigm, right? And to perhaps even come up with new rituals, because obviously culture keeps moving and shifting and society keeps progressing. So it's to also artistically create new forms of existence in terms of ritual and culture. But since we are pressed for time, I'm just going to lastly close off with a poem. This poem was written last year as a meditation, but also as a point of frustration for the crimes that had been reported, the homophobic, violent crimes that had been reported throughout the country, but also our government's lack of action in South Africa, how the president just issued a single statement in a random speech and that was it, and how I was feeling very much alone, even though I exist in a community, in a family, how I was experiencing, feelings of loneliness. And so I took to the page in order to meditate on what was happening, but also as a form of personal healing. The poem is called Ukufa Kwethu. The tears finally came today, came and fell like the corpses that crashed at Easter and lent no resurrection to the crucified. I knelt before strange queer graves that screamed from beyond and asked for amahubo that I could not summon. Dear beloved, we are gathered here today, Sanbonani there at the back. We are gathered here to bid farewell to fruit harvested unripe by greed, untamed, unchecked, unseen by the Old Testament that wrote a death sentence in chapters stolen from the truth. Ruth, youth sacrificed at the altar of blasphemy. Where are the gods that poked into the universe and blanketed it with the rainbow? Where is the commander-in-chief? Blood drowns the streets, chokes newborns as Inkosi ibalekela Africa. I used to know my way home. Yet this hour finds broken compasses in our breast pockets, shattered by ukuthukwa kwezinyanya. I am, we are broken, in need of songs hidden under my art scale to weigh azanya, zinja. This is a cracked poem in memory of Izitsha Zethu. This is a spell biblifying ukufa kwethu. Thank you.
Okay. It's hard to say anything after that. Sad poetry, rather. It's a lament. It's hurtful commentary. But I think it's within this hurtful commentary that we kind of carve the landscape to show people, to reveal to people the pain that comes with homophobia. And homophobia is death, and homophobia also kills slowly. I was just commenting a few moments ago with a friend to say, people, they love stigmatizing things like homosexuality, mental health issues, depression, but we also kind of are good with then sort of like mourning suicide, suicide, but then the process of getting there is stigmatized. So thank you for that poetry, and I think a lot of people will have something to say about it. I'm going to have to open the space for the people to come in, say their comments, ask questions, engage. Yeah, thank you so much, Sfundo. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Princess. Thank you.
If you'd like to ask a question verbally, you're welcome to put up your hand, and then I will direct you to Princess. But in the meantime, Princess, I'll just reflect what's in the chat box. I did right. Oh, well, how do you do this now? Okay, Melisi, have a go.
Oh, I thought you were going to buy me some time. I don't know.
I can read what was there if you prefer time.
That's fine. I just want to, because I was making notes on my notepad, so I just want to look those, center my thoughts first.
Okay, excellent. So I've got this knee-jerk reaction to hands coming up. So what I wrote was that in a recent article in the Mail and Guardian, I think the author's name was Hugo Cunham, that homophobia is unlikely to come from African indigenous religion. And he writes, African spirituality embraces queer ecstasy, touchings, laying on of hands, shaking, collapse, charms and magics that resist rules and recipes. And I just wanted to ask Sfundo to comment on that, if he agrees or disagrees, what he thinks. Because, I mean, that's very provoking, but at the same time, I know that what is this word? Pentecostalism is actually much more global than African, but I still think it'd be very interesting to hear this. And then I just wanted to drop one more thing in, and that is, you don't need to justify queerness with history, but it's also everyone's right to find themselves in history. Everybody needs to feel continuity and belonging, and it's their entitlement. So that was the first comment. I'm going to give you the other comments as well, so you can respond as you wish. Nkululeko said, it is intriguing that when one is transgressing the norm, there is the notion that agency should be given. Agency is a gift that all human beings possess. Karabo agreed, I completely agree. Someone's existence shouldn't have to be justified or contextualized. And Mercy agreed. She said, yes, Precious. Toni Morrison tells us about how racism also takes up our time with the need to justify our existence, although she as a scholar also leans heavily on history. Over to you, Princess.
Okay, I think Sfundo will respond first to the question around the one that you gave, and then I'll come in.
Is this the one about ritual and
African spirituality? Yes.
Sure. No, I agree with that. I do think African spirituality has a particular place for queerness. For example, in isiZulu, there's a term called inkonkoni. Now, currently it's a derogatory term. It's a term used, as slander, as homophobia, basically. But when we go to the root of the term, inkonkoni is a wildebeest, basically. And shamans, isiZulu shamans called the Zangoma, use the tail of the wild beast to make ishoba, which is a spiritual item for divining within Ubungoma. So I'm trying to allude to the fact here that indeed that particular scholar has said is interesting, because the more we go back, at least for me, and I agree with you, as you said, one finds solidarity perhaps within the history. The more we go back, the more we realize that indeed queerness has been perceived as something sacred within the African context. And this is not necessarily to justify or to bring up evidence, but it is to rather to look at how the peoples of Africa have viewed queerness, right? Because if you're only going to view queerness within the current queer theory gaze, which has been powerful and useful in its sense, then I think as an African, we run the risk of not knowing what has been said about queerness in the past. And I also think that's important, because if we know where we come from, then we can know where we're going. So it's interesting for me to just document these different ideas around queerness within our collective history.
Yeah, certainly, Sfundo. And I think the archive is important in locating the self. But I guess what I was trying to say with that is I don't want us to be preoccupied with the justification, right?
Sure,
and I'm saying it is also enough to say, I am here, I'm queer, so Africa is queer, right? So it's important, it's necessary to fetch yourself within the history, or to locate yourself or situate yourself within the history to find you. But it's also okay to say, I am here, therefore Africa is queer. And then on the subject of what Catherine said, I do agree with the writer to a larger extent, but I also think we need to be careful about portraying a saintly Africa in this whole conversation of homophobia, in this whole conversation about homosexuality. We need to be quite careful. I would not totally agree with the writer, but to an extent I do. I think at this point, before, I don't know if somebody wanted to come in, but we have Mkolisi, I'm sure you're ready to come into the conversation. Yeah.
I am. And actually, so interesting, your most recent contributions from the both of you are going to tie in with what I initially was going to come in and talk about. So I'm probably going to start there. So I think, I completely understand your discomfort by you. I mean, for instance, discomfort with regards to like this need of going to history for the need of saying, oh, the reason why we exist is because we existed before, right? But I think someone alluded to it, but I think we should never underestimate the importance of positioning yourself. And we must ask, why are we going back to history, right? We are not going back to history for the homophobes or for the other. We are going back to history for ourselves as queer bodies and queer people, right? To locate yourself in a time and a place. Time and place for your own reassurance, because you grow up and you're brought up in a world where you're constantly reminded, and this is why the history is important, and I don't think we can downplay this, where you're constantly reminded that you are an abnormality, right? You are something that does not happen in this context. Therefore, a lot of people question their identity largely from that, right? Because they think that they think the feelings that they may have are natural, they're an anomaly that doesn't happen, this aberrant thing that happens once every millennia, this glitch within the matrix, right? So by you then placing yourself and contextualizing yourself in history, we are doing it for ourselves, and we're doing it for other queer bodies who may be uncomfortable with their queerness from that point, because they don't see themselves reflected, right? And it's the same reason why, the reason why we go back to history is the same reason why we shout from the rooftop so much about representation, right? It's when you are seen and when you see yourself now, yesterday, and tomorrow that you start to actually realize, okay, I am normal, right? And we have to do this because we've been framed, and queer bodies have been framed in such a way that they've been othered. So in unothering, actually, it's sad, it's annoying, It requires work from us. It requires us to expel and expand energy. But I think we can never downplay the importance of that task, especially for queer bodies in different settings, right? Queer bodies who may approximate themselves in history, who are knowledgeable in history. I think when they contribute and say, actually, there's a painting from 1640 something of this. It's for you and I, it might actually be, it might be a minute thing, it means nothing, because much of our queerness may be rooted in something else. But for someone else who's maybe a history buff or very much interested in that, it's like, oh, okay, so I just haven't existed now. I've existed long in time. And I think so that's important. That's the first point that I wanted to raise. The second point is around language. So I'm not sure, and I'm still mulling over it, right? And it was when we started initially, this was pressed. Actually, before I go to that, let me park that. Actually, this is the third point. The second point has to be linked to spirituality and African spirituality. African spirituality is very fascinating for me, right? So I'm undergoing a similar process to what Sfundo is going through at the moment, right? And you're learning, particularly gender. I think I had my own assumptions going in, where gender and sexuality are concerned. The notion, for example, that there are people who physically present as males, who may identify as males, who are then referred to in African settings as ugogo and not umkhulu, for example. And there are instances where it's the inverse, where someone who physically appears as a woman, or who may even identify as a woman, right, is then called umkhulu, right? And when you are called umkhulu and when you are called ugogo, sometimes it's not abnormal for umkhulu to then want to, umkhulu who, for us physical beings, comes across as male, now wants to marry another man, right? Or comes across as female, sorry, wants to marry another woman, etc., etc. Africans, and particularly people that are understand the nuance of African spirituality, actually sort of navigate those things well. And like I've also found it very interesting in them talking to older family members. I find, and I always think that there's a weird glitch in the matrix. I don't know if I'm the only one who's observed this. It's just an observation, where older Black people that are like 75 and above, and the old Black people that are between the ages of 40 and 70, their stances on homosexuality aren't the same. Their stances and their takes on homosexuality are not the same. Like my grandmother, it's not an unfathomable idea. She where it's different, and I think where sometimes where certain Africans have problems with the expression thereof, right? So they want to police the way that homosexual people and queer bodies want to express themselves. So I think that sometimes is the issue, where people are uncomfortable with how we find expression of homosexuality, but they don't have issue with homosexuality itself. And I also maybe wonder how much also history plays into that, right? Apartheid and colonization and the introduction. No, Mercy, I don't mean like old people, I'm just saying the 40 to age, 70 age group. I should have been a lot, but at one point, the 40 to 70 age group, it's very particular for me, I think, but it's a very interesting group, because I think it's not a mistake that sort of coincided with a lot of apartheid legislation that was anti-queer, a lot of the forest town raids, and a lot of, sorry, one more. So it's about language. The last point is about language. It's just a question actually to the floor. Is it courageous to be queer? Like, is it courageous to be queer? Does one need to engage in resistance? And by courageous, I mean, like, it is one living one's true self, right? One being authentically who they are. And an element of courage for me, I always think that courage is just when one possesses courage, like the skill set or an ability that's more than your ordinary skill sets, right? It's above and beyond. I don't want to be courageous. I just want to be. I don't want to have to put in labor. I don't want to have to like put in so much time and effort to my queerness to be protected. Can I just exist without burdens being placed on me? And sometimes I wonder if the language of courage and even resistance, like it suggests that either I'm resisting against, so like I'm engaged in some sort of war, and I don't know. Yeah, okay, that's an interesting point. That's a very interesting point. Catherine really has a really interesting response to that, and I really like it. That's all I'm going to say for now.
Thank you, Toys. And I think everything else that you said, I totally agree with. And to the last point, Africa, especially African statesmen, have made it hard for people to live their truth. right?
Mm.
So then to be yourself is to engage in the labor of trying to substantiate, justify, and live, just to breathe, just to survive, which is what the whole battle is about. Otherwise, there wouldn't be any form of resistance, right? Because you're being accepted for who you are, but you have to justify yourself on the streets. You are surveilled, you're controlled, you're policed. So that's where then the courage comes in. It's a revolutionary act to be a queer person, even
I
to
think
love.
so. I think
Yeah.
so. But I do agree with Olise when he says, can't we just be, because there sometimes comes a point where you go, can't I just exist without so much baggage from society or from history? But then again, we experience our queerness differently, depending on the family you come from, the country you come from, the society you come from. We experience queerness differently. And I think some of us are called to be courageous, right? Just for being queer. We exist in, as I said, hostile environments where you now have to, as Princess has just said, you have to rise up and say, okay, I'm taking space as a queer body. But just to go back one more time on the whole issue of history and documentation, I think in the whole queer narrative, because so many of us are interested in queer studies at the same time, I think different individuals will do different or contribute differently towards the queer narrative as a collective. Some of us will speak for, just existing and taking our human rights as we rightfully deserve them. But some of us will go into the past, some of us will go into art, some of us will go into philosophy and politics. And I think it is important that we don't look at the contribution as perhaps this one over that one, or, it's different strokes for different folks, and we're all interested in different things. And I think it's important that these different voices and interests take the floor.
Thank you, Sfundo. Let me go to Simamkele. She's been waiting for a while now.
So just to say, we've got 10 minutes and we've got 3 hands up.
No, right.
Okay, so my question is around the vocabulary that has been used in this discussion. So the vocabulary that has been used in this discussion has centered around the word bodies, with particular reference to queer bodies. And then my question is, what are your views on the critique of characterizing and framing marginalized beings like queer and Black people through the word body, especially looking at the history of slavery and colonialism and the dehumanization that came with those systems of oppression, where our value as oppressed people was only through our bodies, the labor that our bodies could perform to further empire?
All right. I'll give that to Sfundo, but also I'll just throw in to say, I think our bodies, as you've just suggested, they are sides of maybe tragedy, but also sides of triumph. So Sfundo, if you may want to come in there, I just thought I would throw that.
Yeah, but I also think it is our bodies that have been policed. It is our bodies that have been deemed illegal. I mean, we can, of course, exist in a philosophical sense, in a psychological sense. Yet at the same time, I don't think we can overlook the fact that homophobia often does attack the body, right? Whether it's the brutal violence or whether it's the parents saying, don't walk like that, don't talk like that, stand like this, etc. It is the children bullying the queer body in school. So I think to use the body as a site of negotiation, right? Because even when you initiate, for example, into spirituality, you initiate through the body. The ancestor possesses a body, right? So going back to queerness, I think we've been so restricted and policed through the physical apparatus that I also think it is interesting and important to go to the physical apparatus, and each individual ascribes whatever form of liberation that they can.
Yeah, thank you. I hope, Simamkele, you are answered. If not, we'll have to come back to that subject, because I have a lot to say as well in terms of the body and queer people, because even the persecution, mostly it's about bodily behavior. So let me just go to Nomcebi C, then Tumi, then Messi. Perhaps we can just get the comments and the questions at one, and then we can respond after they've all registered their concerns or they've commented.
Okay, thank you. I think since we're gonna continue the conversation about the body, I would have wanted to address that, because there's a certain, because whenever I think about when someone says the body, right, and the person who's receiving the knowledge, what it does immediately, if you have to think of visually, what it does already, it decapitates the person, right? And I'm wondering if these narratives are coming from decapitated people. Who are these narratives coming from? So when you speak as yourself now, are you continuing the decapitation, right? That's one question. But I think we're looking at the language situation. I think as you mentioned earlier, last night's conversation, when we were remembering bell hooks, and I think Uze, to mention something that I'm very interested in, I think I'm bringing up because I'm very interested in the issue of language, right? And as a person who has come across Philip Nyobesa's work and her, what they call the long poem, but also fiction. So no one knows what to call it, because what she does with the language, which is the idea of, making language a breathable place. So this idea of when you're writing yourself, you create spaces for other things to come up, right? And her ideas of, if you're writing long, you press on the L, right, as a means of pressing on the body for the body to feel something and something to evaporate from that, the awakening of something else. And I'm wondering then, if we're saying that we're not going to history to speak back to colonialism, then which means that you're changing the intention. So who are you speaking to? Then, which means for me, then even the language in which you use to speak changes, for example. So I'm looking at the works that's done by Saidiya Hartman and the kind of concept that they're using, because the concept of resistance for me brings on a certain kind of movement in the body, right? This constant situation. And I'm also aware of what it does to the body, this idea of resisting. So we can't say that it doesn't create residues in the body, right? So what they're offering a different language, which is this language of refusal. So refusing the status quo, presenting the life that we're living right now as livable. So which means that when you're refusing, then it creates this idea of negation as something that is generative, right? So then what is the other thing? What are the other conversations that are coming from this refusal? For example, there's a situation that was around in South Africa, language here in South Africa that we're using a lot, this idea of andizi, right?
And this is why.
Which is the other way of a refusal. But then what we're missing, that in that refusal, there's a creation of a language for another possible world that could house these other bodies. And my intention is what are the possibilities of making these those kind of workshops where we're generating this language that we're already presenting in the refusal, right, of these people, or in the kind of andizi of these people, and what kind of language is it offering us? It seems as if this kind of resistance is getting another kind of narrative. I'm not sure that it is for the kind of project that we're looking for, which is to step a little lighter on this earth, I suppose.
Thank you. A lot to think about from that. I don't know if it was a question, but it felt like a whole contribution and partly an answer to the question around bodies that Simamkele asked. Let me get to Tumi and Messi.
Great. Hi, thank you so much. So the question that I wanted to ask to Sfundo has to do with what you're saying about the gifted queer body in terms of African spirituality. If I'm articulating it incorrectly, please do correct me. And, you know, I don't know, a lot of the discussion ended up a little stuck around what happens in history and how you're bringing it into the present. And I think I agree with everything that has been said so far. The only suggestion that I would like to make, and that is if you're ever interested in it, Sfundo, when you are carrying on with your research, is how, you know, this gift, the gifts, the spiritual gifts that queerness comes with, actually play themselves out in some township settings, as far as I know, right? So without giving away too much information, with, you know, with no permission really to do so, and please do contact me if you are interested in this. But you know, there are some relationships that are formed between people, between you know, with heterosexual couples, bringing in a queer person into the relationship after getting the advice to do so, you know, by a spiritual practitioner, right? And the reasons for this sort of relating are very economic. Though I suspect that there are other reasons. So to put it like very simplistically, but you know, if someone like you was to look into it, you would probably be able to glean more from it. But very simplistically, it's just a matter of having a queer person in a relationship with you as a way of bringing you luck. Right? So the financial gains of the family go up and so on and so forth. But then what then also obviously happens is that this very queer person also then shares in whatever prosperity that the family then starts to make. So I think I think that would be a very interesting way of looking at how the spiritual gifts of queerness translate themselves into the modern and especially into the urban Black setting, which a lot of people, I think, incorrectly think is already set up to be homophobic.
Mm. Thank you so much, Tumi. I'm also sure that was, in a way, a contribution and something for Sfundo to consider as he furthers research and all the work that he does, and of course in his individual capacity. Thank you for that. Messi.
Okay, thank you, Precious.
Princess.
Sorry. Thank you, Princess. I'm not sure.
Don't worry, a lot of people do that. Precious Princess.
Thank you, Princess. I'm still just thinking about the comment which was raised from the Malian Guardian, which was written by Prof. Hugo Kanam, and also the response which you gave to it. And I just wanted to speak very shortly about the way I've also been going back to look, the way I've been prompted to go back into history to understand girlhood and to try and understand issues of sex, because of the way we are told at the moment that African girls are a problem because they are getting pregnant, they're dropping out of school. And in wanting to try and understand why African girls are getting pregnant, I've had to go back to history to see how sex used to be understood, how it was performed, what were some of the things that were allowed in our traditions and our religions that were then interrupted by certain colonial discourses. So in thinking about that, I found out certain things which have made me think that maybe, Princess, when someone says this thing was not done by Africans, it doesn't necessarily mean that we are silencing the violence of also African discourses, but we are actually saying maybe there are certain ways that things were done which can lead to to productive ways of thinking about the current ways in which we are understanding things. When you look at, for example, the coloniality of gender, the things that we take for granted, like the way we understand gender, the fact that when we look at maybe Amadaume's work from Nigeria, who speaks about the fact that the way we understand gender now is not even the way gender was understood and performed. It was never linked to sex. I feel like maybe if we go back there, we would be able to have more productive conversations about, okay, so this is the way it used to be, and then the coloniality brought this, and then this is where we are. So what can we do now in order to understand maybe even queerness? So that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you so much for that, Mercy. And I totally appreciate, and I guess we needed more time. You and I always need more time to unpack, especially when we begin debates around these concepts. But I think I also didn't get to extensively explain that what I was saying is we need to just be careful. But I totally get the idea that there's a lot we can tap into, especially with the African ways of being and our knowledge systems that can help us further in dealing with our own issues. Certainly, I do agree. But I think as a scholar, in queer studies, we've written a lot of articles that seek to justify, you know what I mean? So I think in terms of scholarship, I was just suggesting that we kind of move towards dealing with the problems that we have in the current, and just the idea that there are queer people in the current is enough evidence to say queer people exist in Africa, and move towards finding maybe in history the systems that can help us search forward, other than being preoccupied with what I'm calling the justification. So anybody else with something to say? Clayton, Beatrice, I know you're coming in as an activist. You're a director of an organization. Anything you'd love to say?
Princess, we have to wrap up, I'm afraid.
Oh, okay.
I'm gonna hand over to Jill. Sorry. Okay, go ahead. You want to say your last bit? Sorry.
Yes, I guess this suggests that we definitely need to have another conversation of the sort. So I'll allow Sfundo to just say his last words or parting shot.
Yeah, thank you, Princess. How I wish I could engage the last three speakers. Yeah. Thanks to me for that suggestion. I'll definitely be looking into that, because spirituality, particularly in KwaZulu, is interesting, because we, in one way, take the other, and we always ascribe it to some sort of a spiritual benefit. For example, I mean, the brutal killings that have been happening to people who live with albinism, because the idea there is that, you know, these rituals are supposed to bring us luck. But that's an entire different talk altogether. But in conclusion, I would like to perhaps just briefly allude to what Unomcebisi said, which I thought was very, very important. The idea of who it is that we are communicating to, and who it is that we are communicating with, which I think is also, Princess, your agitation. The idea that queerness only exists through the heterosexual gaze, or that we are only queer when we are responding to homophobia, right? And that we cannot be queer in and of itself, but also that we have other aspects of humanity that exist within us, and that, you know, to be preoccupied with the other and proving to the other or justifying to the other I think is also dangerous, because it keeps us stuck. But I think what Nomcebisi said about the body and about language is so interesting, because, for example, in KwaZulu-Natal, queer mostly male individuals in townships have come up with a new language called Ismu. It's been around for perhaps the past decade or so, but isiNgoma is basically a trio of isiZulu, where queer bodies have in perhaps their sense of existence or to look for a sense of belonging, have come up with a new language with which to speak to each other called isiNgoma. And for me, that's where the interest lies, is how we as queer Africans negotiate, discuss, explore, and look into this queerness that we exist in. So as to, as a speaker, I think it was what Olisi said, so as to find a place of not only historical and cultural belonging, but to also allow the generation to come, you know, in order to look at into our art and our research and find spaces of being, which I think this is what Wole Soyinka speaks about when he speaks about ritual theater as a way in which to master the human condition. And that's what I'm interested in. Thank you so much, Princess, and everyone here today.
Thank you, Sfundo. I think Catherine is really doing her job really well. Yeah, so basically, this leads me to thank everybody who's come here. Thank you so much. But I think what we are also converging on, the idea is that we've inherited a lot of boundaries, a lot of prejudice, a lot of myths, and it will take us a lot of work to kind of dismantle this, because we know boundaries, they kind of reinforce normativity. And so there's still a lot of work to be done. Thank you for the work that you're doing, Sfundo, and the work that everybody here is doing. And thank you for sparing a moment to come to this conversation. We know that within our context, this is an unpalatable conversation, one that people are not always willing to participate in. So thank you so much. I appreciate everyone here. I'm going to give this time to Gillian.